For most of my life, I defined Christianity as a system of beliefs. What made you a Christian was what you believed. But as I got older, I noticed something, two things actually. First, I noticed that a lot of people believed all the beliefs considered correct in our denomination, but they were still pretty nasty people. In fact, the more sure many of them were about the correctness of their beliefs, the prouder and meaner and more judgmental they became. Something about that didn't seem right. Second, I noticed that this emphasis on correct beliefs didn't square with the Jesus you meet in the Gospels. For example, you never read in the Bible that someone came to Jesus one day and said, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment?" And Jesus said, "This is the greatest commandment. Thou shalt have the correct beliefs. And the second is like it. Thou shalt organize thy beliefs in the correct system and honor them in the correct rituals and liturgies." The same goes with Paul. You never read Paul writing, "Now abide three things: rituals, hierarchies, and correct beliefs, and the greatest of these is correct beliefs." Now, I'm a big fan of beliefs. I think they're fascinating, and I invested a lot of my life in trying to perfect my system of beliefs. But later in life, I've had to admit that beliefs simply aren't the point. At the end of my life, God isn't going to take me off the conveyor belt and put my brain through a scanner to check it that it contains the correct beliefs. No. The point isn't what you believe or what you say you believe. The point is how you live, who you are, who you become, your way of life. And according to Jesus and Paul and the other apostles as well, the way of life is love. That's the most revolutionary thing about Jesus and his message. His unique and utter emphasis on love. When Jesus is asked about the greatest commandment, he says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And equally important, he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Christians have been obsessed by beliefs for a long time. We're right at the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. For the last 500 years, Protestants and Catholics have been arguing about who has the best set of beliefs. How many thousands of hours have we spent in those arguments? And the more we argue, the more we reinforce the same shared misconception that beliefs are what mattered most. Even before the Reformation, if you go back to the 4th century in the time of Constantine, Christians started using a system of beliefs as their measure of who is an Orthodox Christian. Pretty soon, people were being imprisoned, tortured, banished, and even burned at the stake because they had the wrong beliefs. It's pretty ironic, isn't it? Jesus said the greatest commandment was to love, and then, in the name of Jesus, people started rejecting, imprisoning, torturing, banishing, and killing other people in the name of beliefs. That's why the first migration, the first journey we need to take, is a journey back to love. We need to climb out of those little fortresses we built to defend our systems of beliefs, and we need to get on the path of love. That's the way of Christ. That's the way of discipleship. That's the way of life. If we put love back in the center, everything will change. Our churches will reorganize as schools of love. We'll develop and continually improve a curriculum of love. We won't simply train pastors and other spiritual leaders as defenders of beliefs, but we'll train them to be examples and teachers in the way of love for God, self, neighbor, stranger, other, outcast, outsider, an enemy, and for the earth on which we all depend. That will be a new day for Christianity when we migrate to love.
Well, Brian, to guide our discussion today about the way of life and how to live with love, we've collected some questions from your readers.
Great.
Brian, why is the question, what will the church look like in the future, a dangerous one?
I like to say that that's a dangerous question. I get asked it a lot for this reason. When people ask it, very often they say, oh, you're one of these guys who talks about future trends. What are the future trends? What's going to happen so we can adjust to it? A little bit like, what's the stock market going to do? You know, but the whole idea is how can we adjust to it? And you know, when you think about that, that's incredibly disempowering. Something's going to happen. We're going to have to live with it. It's very different to say, what are the dangers, what are the threats, what are the opportunities, and what do we need to do as leaders, as pastors, as Christians? What do we need to do to help achieve the best possible outcomes at this moment? So to me, that's a very different question than what's the future hold. It's what is our calling in this moment of danger and opportunity.
What would it look like for a church to migrate towards the way of life of love?
I think in some ways this would be like being born again. I think it would be a new beginning for our churches. You think, for example, when a child is born and enters a process of Christian education, we probably don't even have that much of an idea in a lot of our churches what we want that child to learn by the age of 5 or 10 or 15 or 20. But one thing's for sure, I've never been part of a church where we've said, this church is about love. We're a school of love. We know that we want children to learn how to love by the time they get 12, 14, 16, 18 years old. My goodness, how that would change things, if we said, here are the skills of love we think a 5-year-old knows and can learn, and here's the skills of love we want somebody to know by the time they reach puberty, because whole new sets of challenges and dangers and opportunities come along then. Boy, we better learn the key lessons of love there. You think, what would it mean for a 24 or 28-year-old who's just entering their career, that part of our discipleship is about the love of money, because Paul said the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. How are we going to help people balance money with their love for their family, their love for their friends, their love for the earth? You think this would go all through life. People get older and they move into retirement, and this shift happens where you start, if things go well, being less concerned about your own success and more concerned about the success of your children and grandchildren. A lot of folks as they get older, they don't get any training in what it means to be a loving elder in that stage of life. And so a lot of older folks, they just become grouchy or depressed, or they feel useless, like they don't know where they fit in, Everything would change if we said life is about love, and our goal is to help you be the most loving version of you at your age, at your stage in life.
So I've got a question for you. What would you say the distinction is between beliefs and faith?
Oh, it's a great question. If we want to say faith is an attitude of the heart, it's an attitude of dependence and humility, confidence, trust. And beliefs really are opinions or ideas or statements. And I think what's happened is we've mixed the two up. Some of it has to do with our words. We say belief and faith are kind of synonyms, and then beliefs becomes a synonym for faith. But here's the irony, it seems to me. Faith has this element of unknowing. Faith has this element of I'm trusting in the character of God, even though I don't understand everything. Whereas beliefs end up being statements of my understandings, right? So ironically, we discovered there's a big difference between having faith in God and having certainty in our beliefs. And that, I think, is a struggle many people have. A lot of people think when they lose confidence in their beliefs, they're losing confidence in God. But I actually think there's a way that until some of the scaffolding of our beliefs gets shaken up and pulled away a little bit, we never even know whether we actually on this deeper level have real trust in God.
Brian, this question's a little bit more personal, but where did you learn what you know about love, and what were you taught growing up? How did that shape your understanding of love?
Yeah, well, look, I think all of us would say that our parents played a big role. Most of us, I think, fortunately can say our parents set a beautiful example for us. I think there are some people who a lot of what they've learned about love is what their parents didn't do for them, and there's sort of a negative way. But I'm certainly a case study, and a child who came into a family where I knew I was loved, and I saw examples of love in my family. I was fortunate enough to have a series of mentors in my life. I was a teenager, and this older guy, he was actually my summer camp counselor, took me under his wing, and he just believed in me. And I'll just tell you, the thought of being a leader never crossed my mind. I was a good student. I was a sort of a quiet musical kid. You know, I liked the outdoors, but leadership was not my thing. He said he thought I had gifts of leadership, and he was such a loving person that his example just, I wanted to be like him, you know, it inspired me. I'd have to say, though, the most important place for me learning about love was as a pastor in church, partly because I reached the limits of my own ability to love very quickly. And partly because I actually got to see people week after week who were just like master craftsmen in the skill of love, you know? And I'm sure we all have that in our congregations. You know, this lady who shows up every Sunday and she lines up the donuts, you know, in the refreshments tray perfectly. And I'm trying to make it easy for her, and I'm saying, you know, you could just cut the tops off the boxes. And she said, you stick to preaching. She said, I stand behind that counter, and when people come up and they choose their donut, it's my chance to talk to them and make sure they feel welcome, you know? And I realized, boy, she is on a different level, you know, in this than I am. So I think there are so many different examples that we see, and to me it's one of the great values of the work that we're all involved with in church leadership. That in a sense, we get a group of people together and everybody gets exposed to specialists in love in different ways.
You talk about ritualizing love. What are some examples of what that means?
Yes, well, I'm a big believer in ritual and liturgy. My definition of a ritual is when we use our bodies to bond to meaning. So you could think that the liturgy or the order of service in our churches is a succession of rituals. People don't think of it this way, but singing is a ritual. I don't know if you've ever thought about how when you sing, we're breathing together, you know, and we're saying the same words together. Hopefully we're reflecting and bonding to their meaning. And then we're also doing things like art and beauty and harmony. I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful ritual. What would happen if our songs actually led us into love, the kind of love that we really need? I've often thought, you know, most churches have some sort of a welcome or a call to worship at the beginning. I've often thought, what would it be like to be part of a church where the pastor were to get up each Sunday and say, listen, folks, the reason we're here is we're here to learn how to love. We're here to learn how to love God and ourselves and our neighbors and the earth. So whoever you are, wherever you're from, we're all on the same level here. We're all students learning how to love. That's why we're here. I would just change the way I experience that service, you know. You think about the Eucharist. So many churches, and I'm someone who loves the Eucharist, but even people who've been part of the Eucharist for their whole lives, I bet if you took them aside and said, what does this mean? You know, they wouldn't be too far ahead of the little kid who said, I really like that they have snacks, you know. I just wish there were more. But then to say, no, the Eucharist is about a table. A table is a place where we say we're family, you know. So here's a place in the world where it doesn't matter what race you are, it doesn't matter what socioeconomic status, it doesn't matter whether you're documented or undocumented. At this table, we model the love of God for all people. My goodness, how that would change the way we celebrate the Eucharist. Even to the act of an offering, which is a ritual, you know. You think, if we really could understand, this is a chance for me to say, money controls an awful lot of people, and I'm using money right now as an act of generosity and an act of love. You know, we often call it a love offering, which is sort of a cliche, but if we were to take that seriously, I think it would be amazing. One other example, I mean, you think at the end of the service when we send people out in the world, I mean, I used to feel this as a pastor, I used to think, that guy out there, he's a high school teacher. We're sending him out this week to be an agent of God's love, his body to be full of love, his personality to be full of love, for a bunch of students at that high school, and she's a nurse over there, and you think, oh man, who shows more love in the average week than nurses, you know? And you think, oh, that guy owns a business. He can either see his employees as people to exploit or as people to serve and care for. So I just think all the parts of our church service could be just set on fire with this emphasis and focus on love. Thanks for being with us for this conversation on the spiritual migration from system of beliefs to way of life. We hope you'll join us for our next conversation about a theological migration.